Hey, what's up, guys? Hey, I wanted to give you a little preview of what you're going to see here on the blog in, I think, about 3 days from now, if I have the dates correct here. So we'll make a short story fast here. Clifford Van Beek, as I mentioned a little while ago, created roster sheets for National Pastime, including the same sort of rosters that APBA gamers would recognize. That is to say that there were lineup cards. Now, I'll give you a quick look at what this looked like. This is a different view than the one that I had in my earlier video in which I mentioned this. I'm actually going to set this as a large size so it's a little bit more readable for you. This is only from the American League portion of this. When I actually publish this, we'll make the size small again so that it fits in with the rest of the page. But what happened here with these lineups is, as you can see, Van Beek chose what were the most common lineups at every position, including the positions that every single player played in, as well as the batting orders. It's interesting because he only has 18 players to work with in each of these teams. He does this for both the American League and for the National League and fills this in for both teams. I thought it would be interesting to go take a look and see, what happens when we go through this slowly and see, if there's anything we can learn about it. So I went through this slowly, and you'll read more about this. What I'll tell you is that for just about every team, you can see examples of where either the lineup is perfect, right on with what Baseball Reference lists, or there's something about it that makes it very, very close. So the Philadelphia Athletics, for example, Van Beek has Jimmy Dykes hitting second, which he didn't do that often in real life, but he did eventually starting here around September 3rd, which was in the heart of the pennant race. Van Beek, in terms of positioning, is right on. We're talking about like Al Simmons is playing in left field. Yes. Haas is playing in center. Miller is playing in right. He's 100% right about this. I look at this and I think, how could he have known this? So let's see if I can find this here while I'm talking with you. I do have a copy of the 1931 Reach Guide. Now, we can use either the Reach or the Spalding Guide in 1931. Here it is. It's going to be the exact same thing. And the reason why it's the same is because the source of these statistics in both the Reach and Spalding Guides that year were this How News Bureau in Chicago. If you look through this, you can see it's a little bit complicated. So on the batting part, and I'm sorry for going kind of quick, there's no indication of position. In fact, all of these players are players with 10 games or more, and then for players with less than 10 games, there's very, very basic information. Then you have the club information, club batting, and so on. We'll skip ahead here to the fielding records, and what you can see is that these fielding records are not that easy to use, right? We'll take a look at this as we get to different teams. It would be very, very difficult for Van Beek to use this book to come up with this information if this is what he was using. And as we look through the whole American League section, there's no information here anywhere about lineups at all. There's no information here about the most common lineup. There's no information here about the players that were most commonly in the lineup. There's nothing like that at all, right? So we'll keep this open here for a second, and I'll show you something once we come over to it. The Philadelphia Athletics are just about right on. Most of these teams are just about right on. The Detroit Tigers, for example, have a lineup that is reflective of what Baseball Reference lists as the most common times in which each player started in each position, almost as if Clifford Van Beek were sitting there charting this out one player at a time. There are a few small quibbles that we have about it, but not much, and the defensive positions are exactly right. The Washington Senators lineup is exactly the same as the lineup that was most common in real life. And again, the positions are exactly right. Chicago White Sox is the one that's off, and it's way off, and it's really strange. There are a couple of weird things happening there. We'll talk about the 1930 White Sox later. I have quite a bit of a write-up here, but I don't think that it really gets down under the surface to what the problem is. Now, this is the reason why I wanted to stop here, because of the New York Yankees. So the New York Yankees are interesting because you have Tony Lazzeri, who played in a number of positions. So Lazzeri played in third base, in real life. He played at third base, I should say. He also played at second. In fact, if you look at the most common lineups, you can see Lazzeri at second and a number of them, as well as at third base. That's another thing that you see here in the baseball guide. You see Lazzeri here. How many times did he play in second base? He had 77 games. And over at third base, Lazzeri had 60 games, and yet Van Beek lists him as a third baseman, which is probably correct in terms of the infield, in terms of the most common infield lineup that you had in 1930. It's probably the case that somebody was looking at box scores instead of just looking at this book. If he looked at this book, Lazzeri would be at second base. There's a problem with the Yankees, which is that Van Beek has Rice in right field. He never played in right field in real life. I think that he made a mistake. I think that he wanted to put Ruth in right field, Rice in left field. That would have made more sense. You can read about this more when it comes out. Boston Red Sox are right on with one exception, which is that this guy, Barry, the catcher, was not there. So if Barry had stayed on the team in September, this lineup would have been the lineup. This is basically the Red Sox lineup in September. The problem is that Charlie Barry ended up coaching football starting September 2nd and left the team. He came back the next season, by the way. You could do that back in those days, pull a Deion Sanders. Cleveland Indians are somewhat different, but they're close enough for my considerations. And he gets the fielding positions exactly right. And then the St. Louis Browns, Van Beek gets basically exactly right. The one difference is that he mixes up Kress and O'Rourke's positions, and you could argue that it should be Kress at shortstop instead of third base. Either one technically works. So Van Beek gets most of these right. Right, that's the thing that's incredible about this, because if he's using the reach guide, there's no possible way, there's absolutely no way that he could know what the most common lineups were for 1930. There's just simply no way. There's no section of this guide that has this. I have the 1951 Sporting News Guide back here on this bookshelf behind me, right? And you can guess the reason why I have that if you're an APBA fan. I'm going to tell you that in that guide, there's nothing about the most commonly used lineups. The only way to get this information is to pay attention to box scores. I am starting to believe this sort of story that I've heard other people tell me, that Van Beek went through and used individual lineups in 1930 through the Sporting News. I really believe that that's what happened. There are a couple of mistakes that we're going to talk about later that are really interesting, but when I look through this, I think there's no other way he could have got this information. He could have come up with something, but he wouldn't have been right. That's the thing. The problem is that he gets it right, and he gets it right on. If he wasn't using the lineups, I don't know what he was doing, but every other explanation I can think of is too cumbersome. I think Van Beek had the Sporting News, and I think that he kept charts of the lineups, and I think that was his little hobby in his grocery store. Love to know what you think, and I'll talk to you again tomorrow. Bye.